My name is Michael Guyed, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me is Doomberg. I've always wanted to talk to a little green chicken, so hopefully this will be off my bucket list. So we'll kind of get right into this. Doomberg. I always find it funny that I'm going to refer to you by your handle here, but I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, and I'm actually a very big fan of the way that you frame things, and I understand the importance of the anonymity. Maybe for those that are in the audience, just talk about whatever you're comfortable with as far as your background, the consulting firm, who's involved, or how many people are involved, and why the little green chicken.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be on the Twitter Spaces with you, and congratulations on the lead lag report and the success you've had. And we are a bespoke consulting firm, partners only, and we, like everybody, struggled with COVID and reinvented ourselves a little bit. We started to do some work in the content creator space, and some of the people that we had been helping encouraged us to start our own, and we started Doomberg. And since we didn't have a big social media following to begin with, we decided that the best way to stand out is to be remembered, and you can't be remembered if you don't stand out. And so we created the green chicken as our brand icon, and we are anonymous mostly because we feel that it sort of adds to the allure of the brand. And if one of the things is if people disagree with what you write, they can attack the person, whereas we like to sort of keep the battlefield in the arena of ideas. And so it's just kind of fun. It adds a little bit to the brand, and but it's been a great ride. We've been writing for 11 months now, and soon it's going to be the thing that we do. We hope.
Perfect. Okay, so let's not bury the lead. Let's go right into the name of the space. Let's talk about AMC to start. So, just by way of some background, I'm much more of the asset allocation, Brinson, B. Baron Hood mindset, right? That it's not about stock picking; it's about choosing the right average to beat, quote unquote, the market over time. But like everybody else, I've been seeing these headlines around AMC. You wrote a pretty extensive piece about this kind of remarkable story. Um, Talk about what is happening with AMC and why you think this is just beyond bizarre.
Yeah, so AMC is something we've written about a lot. And I should say up front, we write mostly about energy, mining, commodities, and the Doomberg team has sort of overlap in the Venn diagram between technology background, deep technology and science background, a finance background, and an industrial background. So we all come from heavy industry, commodity type sectors, and that's the vantage point that we write from. And we've been following AMC almost just for fun for several months. Written a few pieces, and it's very clear what Adam Aaron has done with AMC, basically just diluting the shareholder base to the maximum extent possible in order to put off what we think is an inevitable restructuring. We think it raises an eyebrow ethically what he's done, and it's one thing to sort of do it with your own shareholder base, but what he did last week in entering this transaction with the Highcroft mine, which is a long, well understood mine that has some serious challenges to it, is basically taking the same playbook of squeezing as much out of retail as he can to dilute the equity as much as possible, really to save what we think are the debt holders in a cap table. And it's kind of shameless, actually, when you think about it. And we wrote a piece called "A Fool and His Gold" that went into a pretty deep background on the mine itself, the decades of mining that has already occurred there, what's left, how much gold is left, in what form, how viable is it, and when we walk the readers through the events that happened at Highcroft, which came to market via SPAC in 2020, came back to market via SPAC in 2020. The mine is just not economically viable. In Q3 2021, in their November filings, they basically admitted that the technical miracle they needed to process these difficult sulfide ores wasn't forthcoming. The chief operating officer resigned. The chair of the board resigned. The company was running out of cash. Strong going concern language in the 10Q. All the classic turn the lights out type quarter. Stock traded below 28 cents a share. And then suddenly enter Adam Aaron, and they announced this investment that AMC is buying into the equity of the mine. And then 70 minutes after that press release, they issued a $500 million at the market offering. And just to give the listeners on this space some background, Highcroft had 60 million shares outstanding at the time of this announcement, and looks like they're going to issue another 200 to 300 million shares, and then they just filed to begin the process to register yet a billion more shares. So by the time they're done, I suspect they will dilute shareholders 20-fold. None of this money is going to solve. It's not going to change how much gold is in the ore or make it any easier to economically process it. And so it's just sort of the replay. AMC should have filed for bankruptcy post COVID. It's a structurally broken business, and Highcroft was on the verge of filing for bankruptcy until the Adam Aaron came on scene and bailed them out.
I'm curious why you think people are holding on to this narrative around AMC, right? Because I think a lot of these people that are really doing deep dives, they seem to be intelligent. They seem to do their due diligence. That alongside GameStop were sort of the, let's call them original meme stocks. But at the same token, this is something that's been that topped out back in for almost a year ago, right? So I'm just kind of more curious about sort of why you think people are holding on and not kind of holding him accountable on this type of move.
Yeah, his argument would be we would have filed for bankruptcy, and so the pre-existing equity holders would have nothing. And today, we're not worth nothing, and we have a chance. And so that would be the way he would describe it. Now, the company is worth $8 billion today in market cap, still has the same amount of debt. It's still a broken business. Streaming is still taking over the theater business. And that's why you see him flailing around into popcorn making and Dogecoin and Bitcoin and pick your favorite, whatever's trending on Twitter. He seems to try to sort of get beyond to pump stock. All the while, he's been selling hand over fist. And he likes to claim that he still has huge economic interest in the company, but that's sort of future grants that the company is going to give him. He has sold effectively every share that he is eligible to sell and pocketed several tens of millions of dollars in the process. And then, in fact, has bailed out some members of the cap table. If AMC had filed for bankruptcy and reorganized as we thought and still think was the prudent thing to do, then, some people would have lost the money. And that's just what happens in capitalism. But instead, a bunch of retail investors have been suckered into this trade. The stock, 52-week high in the stock is $72, is trading at 16 right now. But more importantly, he entered the COVID crisis with 80 million shares outstanding, and now there's over 550 million, I think, at last check. It's a very simple playbook, which is just pump up the stock and sell and issue as many shares as possible. One of the things that we post sometimes that kind of annoys the AMC apes is we talk about the revenue per share. As AMC recovers, as a shareholder, you're not catching but a fraction of that recovery because they've diluted you so much. And so even if it could reestablish itself to the same level of absolute returns that it did before COVID, in which case it was still a struggling, mostly money losing, cash burning business, your fractional ownership of that has been diluted by a factor of 5 or 6. It's just a fact. And so this is sort of what penny stocks do. We've just never seen penny stock behavior on the sort of multi-billion-dollar scale that we see it today in this and other stocks.
Okay, so again, let's go back to the name of the space. AMC is as crazy as soaring food prices. You mentioned the industrial background of the team, and I'm very much in agreement with a lot of the things that you say when it comes to the commodity complex. Let's talk through sort of the hierarchy of crises that seem to be happening when it comes to commodities. So you've got an argument for sure that we've been sleepwalking into an oil crisis. We're starting to see some of that now. A lot of the guests on my spaces have made that argument for several months. You've got what seems to be a food crisis that most people in the U.S. and probably arguably overseas are not really fully appreciative of yet because we see it in financial markets, but they don't see it just yet at the grocery. So, your name is Doomberg, right? And we'll talk about that momentarily, right? But let's go through that kind of hierarchy of crises that you highlight. What is most urgent? What is something that you see as a longer term issue? Let's kind of talk through some of these.
So one of the things we pride ourselves on at Doomberg is our ability to teach non-financial concepts to a finance audience in a language that they can understand. And at its core, this is a crisis of physics. Physics will not be denied, and we've said multiple times. We coined the phrase, in the battle between platitudes and physics, physics is undefeated. And we might not be able to predict how securities will, the price of various securities will change over time, but we can certainly predict with very high certainty when the laws of physics will be run into. And ultimately, all of the crises, the hierarchy of crises that you just described, are interconnected, and they flow back to an energy crisis. And so ultimately, energy is life. The human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the force of entropy. And literally, our standard of living is dictated by how much energy we get to waste and to impose order on our local environment. And so, energy is food, energy is housing, energy is transportation, energy is heat, energy is lighting, it all flows back to this push, for making an energy transition. And we've been arguing for a long time that the path function matters. And we saw over the span of years, the last couple of years, substantial underinvestment in the highest energy return on energy invested feedstocks, predominantly fossil fuels, in particular oil and natural gas, to a lesser extent coal. And ultimately, that is a snapping of a whip, and the tip of that whip is going to hit the floor in downstream supply chains. And so we've been calling the fertilizer price induced food famine that we're about to experience globally since late summer, early fall of last year. We wrote a piece on October 10th, I believe, called Starvation Diet, where we flagged the fact that China had restricted exports of phosphates, which was going to cause fertilizer prices to spike, which is going to cause farmers to either plant less or use less fertilizer and get lower yield. These things are all interconnected. So fertilizer comes predominantly from, the nitrogen side of fertilizer comes from natural gas and the Haber process, and the phosphorus side of the phosphate side of fertilizer comes from mining, which uses an enormous amount of fossil fuels. And so when you see the natural gas crisis in Europe cause a huge spike in LNG natural gas, on these floating LNG carriers, which then triggers a competition between Asia and Europe. And then that means that the energy crisis that started in Europe spreads to Asia, where we have outsourced all of our manufacturing. You just see this rolling crisis, and it all derives from, at its core, integrated across society, our economic growth and our ability to thrive as a species is toggled by how much energy we can exploit. And if we are proactively turning off nuclear power, which is the highest energy return on energy invested fuel source, and then also proactively restricting the financial support for the development of fossil fuels, it is inevitable that we are going to trigger a mass starvation event. And as hard as we have been flagging this, it's still sort of frustrating and sad to see it play out even worse than we could have expected, all of which only is radically amplified by the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Let's talk about substitutes for a moment because I think it's interesting to think through sort of vulnerability when it comes to price spikes, right? So I did a whole bunch of memes last night making fun of the Bloomberg article and the idea that lentil is a substitute for meat, and had a lot of fun with that. But arguably, there are substitutes to some of these price spikes, right? Yeah, I would even argue that work from home, you can argue, is a bit of a substitute to rising oil prices to some extent because, if you can work from home, you don't need to necessarily get in your car and fill up your gas tank and have to deal with that cost. So, is there validity to the idea that we can handle these shortages in commodities because of technology and because there's so many different options to just survive off of?
I would say that would be possible if we had political leaders who had any training whatsoever in physics, and we don't. And the magnitude of the crisis is still not hitting home. We are working on a piece right now, tentatively titled "Field of Nightmares," where we're going to go through just the cascading series of crises that are hitting farmers both in the U.S. and then worldwide. One of the things we're going to point out, which Chai Girl has been tweeting about on Twitter, Tracy, is this propane shortage in the U.S. and propane spikes and how critical that is to farmers. And by the way, natural gas feeds into herbicides, which are in short supply, and diesel prices are going crazy, and the price shortage, the chip shortage that we see in the automotive sector is hitting the farm equipment sector just as hard. And yet, despite all of this, we still have the Attorney General of the state of Michigan trying to shut down a pipeline called Line 5, which is a key artery that feeds the U.S. propane network, and still basically blissfully unaware of the magnitude of the crisis that we have before us. We still have politicians in Germany opposing the resuscitation of the nuclear reactors that they just shut down. We still have the last remaining nuclear reactor in California scheduled to be shut down in the middle of this decade. We are seeing some politicians realize, notably Germany has cut a deal with Qatar on LNG, yet they don't really have the LNG import capacity to take it. We see that the Prime Minister of the UK is meeting with the nuclear industry to talk about how quickly they could bring things online. But still, I think especially here in the U.S., because we have all of this abundance of natural gas, and the price of our natural gas here is a fraction of what the rest of the world is paying. We've been somewhat insulated in the short term, but fertilizer is a global market. The price of fertilizer is 5x in the U.S. Herbicides are a global market. The price of herbicides are up 5 to 10x. Farmers that pre-bought last year might be able to get through spring, but very soon there's going to be some really substantial challenges. And so I think the depth of the crisis has not yet triggered a seriousness that we need to see from our politicians. We have the Biden administration talking about 9,000 leases as though, the oil industry has been the victim of anti-fossil fuel defunding campaigns for the past decade, which might scare away some capital. This is just the laws of capitalism. If the government tells you that you could be prosecuted for doing your business, you might do less of that business. So I think, unfortunately, we have to have a lot more pain before we trigger the seriousness of the response that we need here. This is truly a global crisis, an all hands on deck situation, and we still have people sweeping the decks as opposed to getting serious about the things that we need to do to help as many people avoid starvation as possible.
Okay, so I want to get a little bit more specific with you on this because a lot of people have made this argument that poor policies got us to this place. What specifically do you think really went wrong? You mentioned this idea that path function matters more, and I always say path matters more than prediction. Right? It's not about the end point; it's about how you get there. So,
Yeah.
what is it in your way of looking at the world that really went wrong over the years here?
So I think we've laid out our policy in a couple of pieces. We put out a piece called America's Energy Strategy is Bonkers. Um, and then we put out a piece a couple of weeks ago, kind of updating that one called The Serious Proposal on Energy. And at its core, I think the biggest mistake we made was simultaneously rolling out intermittent renewables while kneecapping the nuclear fuel industry. And one of the things that many people are learning now that's well known in the industry is there's a vast chasm between intermittent power and baseload power. And baseload power is very critical to the regular operation of a grid. And wind and solar have a lot of issues with them, but the most important one is that when the wind doesn't blow, there's no power, and when the sun doesn't shine, there's no power. And operating a grid is a symphony of balancing things. And so, if you are simultaneously attacking the key baseload inputs, nuclear and coal, while bringing on board more and more intermittent renewable energy, everywhere that has been tried, you see less reliable grid, more expensive, and rolling blackouts, and it crushes local industry and so on. And so, in particular, the most insane energy policy in the world today is what Germany has done to itself, which used to use nuclear to provide a substantial portion of their baseload needs, and has simultaneously built up renewables while shutting down nuclear, while relying on gas imports from Vladimir Putin's Russia. And there's no question in my mind that Vladimir Putin thought he could invade Ukraine, at least in part because he realized he holds all the energy cards. And we put ourselves in that position. We have proactively stunted the growth of natural gas. We have proactively shut down nuclear power. And by the way, even if you're going to roll out renewables, the energy return on energy invested dictates that you have to spend a lot of energy up front to create a solar panel. So many of your listeners to this space would be familiar with a discounted cash flow statement and an Excel spreadsheet, and time t equals zero cash investment. It's the exact same analysis for energy. If it takes 4 years for a solar panel to pay back the original energy that went into it, there's only so fast you can grow solar without tapping out your energy needs and energy resources today. And since we still get 85% of our base energy from fossil fuels, there's just no, the transition has to be paid with fossil fuels. And we choked off fossil fuels before we got too far down on the road on the transition. And what we've tried to warn our friends in the sort of ESG green energy space is, if you get this wrong, you're going to get a political backlash. On the path from abundance to starvation is riot, and people will riot. And we're going to see that. We're going to see food shortages around the world. We're already beginning to see it in some countries that rely heavily on Ukraine for wheat. Seeing it in Turkey, seeing it in Lebanon. Those are going to spread. They're going to pop up chaotically in places where you don't expect it. And if you take away people's bread, as we say in one of our pieces, the path from empty grocery store shelves to the guillotine is a short one. We often ponder that philosophically. How much money is enough? The guy has had a successful career. Even with the scheme that he's pulled off with AMC, he's pulled out several tens of millions of dollars. The long-term fate of AMC, I think, is pretty clear. So, how much is enough? For some people, money is a scorecard, and they can't ever have enough, and that's actually kind of sad. I mean, if I had $70 million in the bank, I wouldn't be tweeting or writing a Substack. I'd find a nice island to go retire on and enjoy my life. Now, I enjoy tweeting and certainly love doing the Substack, but I don't have $70 million in the bank. If I did, I certainly wouldn't be on the hunt for a penny stock failed junior gold miner to invest in as CEO of a theater company. It baffles me, honestly. And ultimately, I suspect that such people are just deeply unhappy. There's no amount of money that can satiate. Let's call it what it is. Their greed. Mudrick was the SPAC, ran the SPAC that took this mine back to the public markets in 2020. Just for everyone's edification, this mine was owned by a company called Allied Nevada Gold Corp, and they promised, that they were going to crack the sulfide ore challenge back in 2014. Went bankrupt in 2050. Emerged from bankruptcy same year. Continued as a private company. Really didn't make much progress, and then Mudrick Capital came in and they did a reverse merger into the SPAC and became public again. And they Sprott is in there in the debt table, Sprott Inc., and they also have a royalty agreement with the company, which is just sort of a form of debt. And ultimately, it was a busted move. And look, as you know, in the junior mining space, not everything works. Sometimes you hit the lottery, hit the mother lode, literally. But most of the time, difficult to process ores are difficult to process for a reason. This mine was mined out in the 1980s and the 1990s. Let's be clear. The good, easy to process oxide ore was drained from this property, and all that's left is low grade sulfide ore. And the industry has struggled to economically extract value from low grade sulfide ores for decades. And to think that a twice busted company that reemerged via a SPAC that spends no money on R&D, that relies on outside consultants and contract research labs for its technology, is going to solve a problem that the industry has been trying to crack for several decades. This is kind of the height of lunacy. And as you say, if you wake up one day as the CEO of AMC with $5.5 billion in debt, but a decent amount of cash because you've been able to dilute your shareholders, 4 or 5 times, and you say, "Hey, a very good use of funds is I'm going to go invest in a junior gold miner." There were plenty of other opportunities that were far superior to a company that just admitted in November that its technology failed and had serious issues with going concern. And chief operating officer resigned, chair of the board resigned, and stock trading below 30 cents a share on the way to bankruptcy. This is just exploitation of the retail fan base that he has built up over time, I think quite shamelessly so. The specifics about hydrotreating and diesel, there is an ongoing concurrent diesel crisis that is unfolding. The price of diesel just reached an all-time high. The issue that Europe is going to face is as we come out of winter, now's the time where they need to be building storage for next year. So the gas is still flowing, to the best of my knowledge, from Russia. It's one of the few sources of hard dollars that the Russian regime still has access to. There's a better person to follow the details of this on Twitter. I just want to get his last name right. He's a Bloomberg reporter, really great reporter. Javier Blas. His Twitter account is at Javier Blas, BLAS. And he's far more into the details on pipeline flows. I can just tell you, looking at the storage data, that they're going to have to buy an awful lot from Russia. And if Russia were to cut them off, it'd be impossible for them to fill the storage in time for next winter, which is when we're going to see a lot of this hit. And if you look at the sort of the forward curve for European natural gas, let me just pull it up as I'm talking to you today. I looked at it last week. They're still pricing out $30 per million BTU natural gas through next year, which is a catastrophe for an economy. So whether it manifests itself in the diesel space, in the fertilizer space, in the chemical space, it devastates the manufacturer. The totality of European manufacturing that relies on natural gas as a predominant input is mind-boggling. And by the way, flip side of that is that just radically advantages U.S.-based manufacturers who can tap into our relatively cheap natural gas for their inputs and can price their products on a global basis, like fertilizer. So companies like CF Industries are just printing cash today. So it's called Doomberg. And you would think that the unfolding of these events would give us pleasure because we have been writing about them for several months. And we are in full prepper mode. I'm an unabashed prepper. I think security starts at home. I think we are going to see food shortages. I think we're going to see hyperinflation in the food sector. I think the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is a catastrophic event. And just because the magnitude of the consequences, that wave, that tsunami has not yet hit our shore, that we're sort of watching the water go out. You know, when a tsunami happens, the water first pulls out and then it comes back and it envelopes you. I think we're going to see it soon. I mean, you can't take the highly interconnected nature of the economy is such that you can't cancel Russia without massive and unpredictable consequences smashing you in the face. And whether it's palladium for the automotive industry, which is already suffering from lack of chips, whether it's neon gas from Ukraine, which is critical for the chip production, which is only going to add further strains to the interconnected nature of the automotive supply chain. I drive around town and I see all of my car dealers have no cars in them, and that we've allowed ourselves to think this is normal. I don't see the path out. I see a lot of people starving. I see a lot of economic disruption. I don't understand. Look, I'm the last person to ask about the price of securities, but I don't know how. The entire tech industry is at the top of a pyramid that forms its base from the fossil fuel and energy sectors, and those industries are signaling substantial pain ahead. And when the price, again, we're working on this piece for the farm sector, like energy is life, and what is the price elasticity demand for life, and who could pay it? And we're going to find out that the Western world has a far larger capacity to pay it, but that sentences hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who aren't lucky enough to have won the lottery of life to have been born here to really substantial hardship. And once you sort of throw a monkey wrench into a chaotic system that's very nonlinear and sensitively dependent on initial conditions, all bets are off. And we wrote a piece called On the Cusp of an Economic Singularity. And the whole point in physics of a singularity is you can't know what's on the other side because the laws of physics break down. We think that we are on the cusp of the laws of economics breaking down and a complete reshuffling of how things are done. And I think the fact that this wave has not yet hit us is creating a level of complacency that we feel is unjustified. If you draw a circle around the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, if we had smart political leaders, we could ride out this storm far better than any other region in the world. There's no question in my mind that Europe is really screwed. Asia, by extension, is screwed because China, in particular, is bidding for the same incremental LNG carrier that Germany is just trying to get from Qatar. Like the deal that Germany cut with Qatar today. I tweeted. I'm sure Japan and South Korea are thrilled. It takes time and billions of dollars and technology and engineering expertise that is in short supply to build out the capacity to receive LNG exports, let alone to actually export them as a producer. It's not like Qatar can just snap its fingers and produce a lot more LNG. The LNG that's going to go to Germany and going to go to the UK is going to come at the expense of countries in Asia. Well, countries in Asia, they do things, and they do things that we rely on. And if we cut them off of their LNG, we're not going to be able to rely on the things that we need. For your point, these sensitive supply chains have been developed over decades. The U.S. has offshored a ton of manufacturing. But I think together, the U.S., Canada, Mexico could make their way through the storm better than the rest of the world. But we're talking about degrees of pain in a market that is priced for lots of pleasure. There is no bullish case. It's literally just 3 letters on a screen, and the bullish case is that there will be enough hype that I can sell my stock to somebody else for a higher price later. The debt is largely the same as it was pre-19. U.S. box office so far this quarter is down, I think, 50% versus 2019. And of course, AMC is selling this as the the big movies are backloaded this year in 2022. We think this is is testimony to the fact that the market share of streaming is relentless. You can't have Netflix be worth what it is worth, and Disney be worth what it is worth, and AMC be worth what it is worth. And we know which one of those three assessments is probably incorrect in the market. Now, having said that, anytime a meme stock trades, the trading of the security deviates from fundamentals in ways that are just inexplicable. So they still have roughly $5 billion in debt. The interest to service that debt is a little higher than it was before 2019. Streaming is still taking market share. The box office is shrinking. Ultimately, in 2019, AMC was a bad investment, and nothing about nothing about 2022 makes it any better, in our opinion. Now, having said, look, I mean, it's three letters on a screen, and people like to trade it. There's pleasure in trading these things, and the options market is deep, and Lord knows that the options market makers are minting on the backs of the retail interest in this security. And if Adam Aaron had his way, he would sell even more shares. He was only limited by failing to get shareholder approval to dilute them even more. And so it ultimately, much like in the energy space, the laws of economics will dictate that an aging theater company with a broken balance sheet is probably a poor investment, especially when equity has been diluted 5 times over since 2019. So vis-a-vis solar, there's a place for it, but the levelized cost of electricity is a bit of a scam, because not all electricity sources are the same. And the thing about the intermittent renewables is they produce when they produce, and not necessarily when you need it. And I would direct the audience to a really fantastic thinker in this space, Mark Nelson. I mean, his Twitter account is @energybants, BANTS. So ENERGY energy BANTS. He's got a really great series of podcasts with Dr. Chris Kiefer on the Decouple podcast, where he walks through the fallacy of using levelized cost in electricity to compare solar to fossil fuel to nuclear. And so this, I leave it to somebody who spent his life working in this space and knows it far better than we do. The solar companies themselves are a little tricky to invest in, because there's a huge amount of government support for it. And if the government is willing to shoulder most of the time T equals zero cost, there's still going to be substantial growth in it. One challenge that the solar industry is facing today, though, which we've written about in a couple of pieces, is the fact that the Chinese have basically taken over the production of polysilicon. They stole Western intellectual property and used cheap coal and effectively slave labor to drive down the cost of solar to the point where it at least appears that it's pretty competitive. That the energy crisis in Europe made its way to China, and the first thing the Chinese did was shut down polysilicon production, because it's incredibly energy intensive. And as I'm talking to you right now, I'm trying to see what the price of polysilicon is in China compared to historical. Yeah, still about $33 per kilogram. And just to give you a benchmark, in 2020, before the COVID crisis, it reached as low as $6 a kilogram. So the price of polysilicon is up 5-6x, which means any sort of perceived economic competitiveness has evaporated with the natural gas crisis that has caused the energy crisis that has spread to China. Yeah, so we've written a lot about the crypto space, and we have some fun with crypto. We're not, it's not our expertise. It's not something that we spend a ton of time writing about. But like all Ponzi schemes, it requires a flow of new money coming in that is faster than the fiat that's being taken out. And we wrote a piece a couple of months ago on it called Dollars Ex Machina, that sort of explained our own history in the space. We've been involved and or knowledgeable or around the crypto space since 2016, 2017. And ultimately, if you draw a box around crypto universe, our question is sort of what's going on inside there that creates new fiat? And the answer is, of course, nothing. And so by definition, it's a leveraged space. and it's a lot easier to put your fiat in than it is to take your fiat out. We don't want to be in the crypto world wars more than we already are. For being totally honest, the two sides are so polarized and the arguments are so well articulated that we've reached a stalemate, and there's not much more that we can add to the arguments that will shift anybody's opinion. And so at some point, we have lots of friends, for example, in the crypto space, and we have just sort of agreed to disagree, and we are pleasant, and we exchange ideas in other areas, and the fact that they might be pro crypto and we might wonder about the viability of it doesn't color our relationship, and we'd like to have more of that and not less. And so we occasionally write about crypto when something interesting hits the news. We think we know what's going on over there. The believers are going to believe. There's no amount of arguing with them that is going to change anybody's minds. And so ultimately we have to see. I think the ultimate resolution will be when the SEC and the Department of Justice finally getting around to resolving the tether question, which is sort of the giant elephant in the room for the entire crypto universe. You have to teach people in a way that doesn't cause them to shut down. And that's why we sort of duck the Tesla question, and also aren't really going to get suckered into the Bitcoin debate, because ultimately one of the driving missions of Doomberg is to teach without being self-indulgent. We have three brain attributes. We say this a lot in our writing, and I've said it on several podcasts, and I'll say it here again. Our objective is to be funny without being silly. Um, you know, our objective is to be provocative without being polarizing, and our objective is to teach without being self-indulgent. And there's two ways to learn: the easy way and the hard way. The easy way to learn is to read about it, think about it, understand it, and change your opinion. The hard way to learn is to run out of food and to participate in a riot because your family is going hungry and you're desperate. We've tried our best to teach as many people via the easy way as possible. And to the extent that you can interact with people in a way that doesn't cause polarization, to the extent that you can teach people in a way that doesn't sound self indulgent or arrogant, to the extent that you can highlight the necessary consequences of poor decisions that are dictated by the laws of physics, not the laws of politics, the more we can do that, the better. And our political leaders, you have to hope that they come from they approach these problems from a basis of a genuine desire to do good with a substantial mountain of ignorance vis-a-vis the seriousness of the challenge and the difficulty of alternative solutions. And ultimately, our good friend Alex Epstein likes to say he's a human first advocate, which is why he's so pro fossil fuels. We are very human centric. We're human first. We care deeply about the danger that many of the impoverished parts of the world are about to experience, and the crises and the panic, and really the tragedy. And we in the Western world that have this amazing privilege of having been born here and having been educated here and having lived this amazing lifestyle for so many decades, we have a duty to start by teaching other citizens and our politicians. Ultimately, we are still representative democracies. Votes matter. The war on ignorance is real, and to the extent that we've been able to participate in the fighting of it, we're proud. To the extent that this has not yielded any tangible results, we're ashamed. But this is real. People will die. Lifestyles will be disrupted. Economies will collapse. This is a big deal, and the sooner people with real power to make change happen to get educated on this and see the reality of it, the better.
I think that's a good way to end the space. Everybody, make sure you follow Doomberg. Doomberg, how do people find your website?
Yeah, so most importantly, if you follow us on Twitter, but you don't yet sign up to doomberg.substack.com, please head over. We're still free. We're going to open up our paywall in April, and then we're going to go exclusively paid in May. It's been an incredible journey. We have a very large following over there. Our pieces get read, anywhere between 60, 100, 200,000 times per publication. We pride ourselves on writing about interesting things and teaching people, but also learning from our audience. And so follow us on Twitter for sure, at Doomberg T, add the letter T as in team to the end of Doomberg. Somebody's squatting on Doomberg, unfortunately. But our primary writings can be found at doomberg.substack.com. Michael, really fantastic. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been great fun, and looking forward to coming back sometime.
No, appreciate it as well. Thank you everybody for joining. And I guess the bottom line is maybe just buy a bunch of lentils. Like, keep going back to that's the only store of value that seems to exist. So thank you, Doomberg. Thank you, everybody.